The hardest part of gardening for me has always been caring. And by care here, I mean this like maternal, warm, and nurturing care where you're actively feeling in and trying to understand what an ecosystem needs, and then actually trying to provide that need. My approach, on the other hand, has always been to just memorize the steps and to-dos of whatever's supposed to happen. You know, this kind of robotic, like, must make compost to feed roots, must water, must make swales to create a more resilient hydrological system. And as long as I've been good enough at remembering all the necessary design elements and daily tasks of keeping a plant alive, things have worked out. But as our forest matures, what we're starting to see is this amazingly individualized growth, where every plant's growth is unique and might be completely different to their neighbor's growth. So they require this individualized attention. And this change is making it so that I can't approach pruning like I used to with this one-size-fits-all approach. So in this sort of hyper-biodiverse ecosystem, it can be hard to know what the correct way to prune is, and if you'll indulge me for a minute, I think you'll see what I'm talking about. Take this blueberry. They were planted about a year ago from a friend's land who was giving away mature blueberry plants from their organic blueberry production. So this blueberry is about 5 or 6 years old now. That's prime productive age, but for whatever reason, they never really grew and are still quite small. Some people might look at this blueberry and say, you need to prune last year's productive branches away so that it can produce again this year. Others might tell you to prune some peripheral branches to stimulate the vertical growth. Others might say, don't cut it at all, feed the soil and let the blueberry grow in their own pace. Others might say, get rid of the bush and get a new one. And others might say, you need to open the surroundings up to a bit more light because the blueberry has too many other trees competing. While some other people might tell you that you need to plant the blueberry with even more neighbors and give it less light so it can start stretching and growing up towards the light. And there's a piece of all of their reasoning that makes sense. They're all right in some way and they're all wrong in some other way. The point is, you might know all the rules and still not know what the right choice is. And how do you figure that out? Silly though it sounds, I'd argue the best way is probably just to care about what the blueberry wants. And like I've said, this doesn't really come natural to me. So lately I've been pushing myself away from looking at farming through the lens of memorizing steps and to-dos, and instead I'm struggling towards one of nurturing, because it's something that I do have a desire to learn. And that's what this video is going to be about. 5 of the ways that I'm noticing pruning is teaching me to care and making me better not only at pruning, but at understanding what a plant and an ecosystem wants. Just a disclaimer, some of these reasons might be common sense to a lot of people, but to me, they've been really rewarding to get down on paper. So, I'd like to start by saying that once you know how to correctly prune a certain species, it's really tempting to just do it. Sometimes I'll see like a current and there's this kind of like odd pleasure that takes over that I imagine like a hairstylist might feel of like, oh yeah, I'm gonna make you so pretty. And then the impulse is to just jump into that like, hey little blueberry, hold that thought, there's no time to chat, it's time for your haircut. And I'm already snipping away. And I don't think this is something that most people would appreciate if it happened to them, but we do it to plants all the time. So what I've been training on myself here, even though it takes me a lot of mental energy to remember, is just to stop for a bit before I prune, to spend some time with the plant or each group of plants, like with raspberries, and just listen. And I do think most people do this, but usually only long enough to figure out how best to prune to get the most or the best quality fruit. But this is an opportunity for me to feel out what else the blueberry needs. Are you getting enough light? How's your soil? Are you getting too crowded in there? Are any of your branches getting a bit too old? Is there something else I'm not even noticing? Like, how are you interacting with the paths? Would pruning you a bit help out your neighbors? This little bit of time whenever I remember to keep it, is so helpful. It's just this beautiful little opportunity to begin the process of figuring out how to treat nature the way nature wants to be treated. And on a slightly bigger scale, this brings in opportunities to start seeing patterns of growth or to figure out how a plant wants to grow. I've forgotten in which book, but I remember reading Fukuoka describe how he'd spent his whole life looking at and pruning his apples. And only near the end of his life did he think he was starting to understand how they actually wanted to grow. And I think this sort of iterative, lifelong process of deepening our understanding of these species can start in these little moments of listening, of spending enough time observing a plant to get a sense of what they want instead of trying to figure out what we want from them. And if you keep pulling that thread, you might even start to ask yourself questions like, is pruning even necessary? Like, take our peaches, for example. I could prune them or not. It really depends on the year. Some produce every year without any help. Some are even starting to self-prune, where they're growing vertical branches that get so heavy with fruit that they lean over while they're ripening and snap. And they're doing this every year like clockwork. Now, we could really start to fine-tune this because it's getting to the point where the forest is shady enough that if there's too much cloud cover in a particular year, the peaches won't ripen. So we could come in and prune in summer so that the tree can focus their limited resources on ripening the fruit that they do have. But the only way to really figure that out is to be there with the peaches, listening to what's happening to them and figuring out how best to react with them. A second thing I'm learning from pruning is to just check in. Because deciding on a course of action doesn't mean that things don't change along the way. Pruning can become aggressive pretty quick, so checking in to figure out if the way I'm treating a tree is healthy or not can be really helpful as well. It's just taking the little opportunity every now and again to ask myself, is the way I'm pruning leading to healthier, more resilient plants, or am I taking away from them and harming them? And I think this style of pruning is a break from most of the advice you've probably heard up until now, because most of the time the focus is on maximizing production. And because most pruning prioritizes production over health, it took me a while to look past how apples are so heavily pruned industrially that their life is reduced by decades, and to start trying to find the healthier parts of pruning, like how hazelnuts, for example, will live somewhere between 50 to 100 years, but when pruned correctly can live for over 200, or how blueberries might only live and produce for 15 years without pruning, or 50 when they are pruned. Which makes the answer to the question, is pruning good, not a simple yes or no, but it depends on how it's done. Which means that checking in, where I'm coming back to observe how the plant's reacting to my pruning with the goal of individual and system-wide health, can be the difference. With this loquat, for example, in theory, I should be pruning the whole tree hard in order to ensure that there's enough air circulation for the fruit to ripen in the high humidity of spring. But I suspect that in this particular location, the south side of the tree will have enough heat to clear out that humidity, and without much pruning, the fruit might be alright. And I'm doing this because while most trees can handle a bit of pruning and might actually benefit from it, it's hard to know at what point I'm taking more from the tree than I'm giving. So what I'm doing here is pruning little sections throughout the tree, especially on the northern side, to test out how much the tree really needs. I'm looking for that point of balance. Of course, I'll have to wait to find out if what I'm doing makes any sense, but that's alright because I'm not in any rush. I'm learning what works and what doesn't. And as the forest matures, the interactions between species will inevitably mature and change, as the nearby avocados, alders, and apples might change how the air circulates. And the needs of the loquat will change as well, and my pruning will have to adapt to their actual situation, which makes pruning more than the simple cutting I do on the day, but an active, longer-term process that includes observation and reflection. Essentially, it comes down to spending a bit more quality time over the coming months and years with my loquat. The next style of care, I think, is the thing that most of us find easiest. And it's also what a large section of basically every permaculture course and video is about. It's about how you feed soil. So just to summarize what we probably all already know, by incorporating organic matter into the ground, you're caring for the cycle of soil formation. Microorganisms in the soil eat, they break that organic matter down and build the fertility that plants will then absorb in order to grow, flower, and fruit. So this small act of incorporating organic matter into the soil is probably the most caring thing we can do for land. By treating organic matter like a gift we can give to the soil instead of a problem, we can establish cycles of fertility with far-reaching benefits like feeding species that are struggling, protecting the earth from the sun's direct rays, storing moisture in fertility, and creating shelter for microorganisms, insects, and even small mammals. And because most of us know the step pretty well, I'm not going to spend too long on it, but I will detail a bit of what we do because I suspect a lot of you are here to find that out, and you'd probably find it caring to have that information. So, oversimplifying what we do is basically just stuff everything we prune into the swales. I think using the swale like this has a few benefits. Firstly, we're putting all that organic matter in the most humid place on the land, which really improves the rate of decomposition and extends the season in which there's sufficient humidity for there to be active decomposition. The second benefit is that the swale kind of envelops the organic matter on three sides, which minimizes the decomposition done by the sun and air and maximizes the biologic decomposition done by microorganisms. Third, centralizing all this woody material into the swales builds strong mycelial highways as the wood breaks down, and also creates this really spongy, fertile earth that will connect to the majority of the tree roots. Another thing I'll do every now and again if I'm in a particularly caring mood is I'll start to break down what I've pruned into smaller and smaller bits. Since I don't have a wood chipper, I have to do this by hand, usually with loppers and pruning shears, which can be quite a long process, but since the smaller you make the pieces, the faster they'll break down, as making smaller pieces means more surface area, which provides greater habitat for microorganisms and translates to quicker fertility. I'll tend to do this for perennial garden beds that need special attention. Species that actually appreciate a fungally dominated soil like yacon or sunchoke. And if you're still curious about anything we do, which I am sure some of you still are, feel free to ask, and I'd be glad to answer those questions down in the comments. I think the next two sections are kind of two sides of the same coin, where they both have to do with me learning to care for myself. And since my mental health is a topic much larger than this video, what I'll do is just try and simplify me to some basics, which are that I'm someone who can use work to avoid having to do or feel certain things, and this has led me to burnout in the past. And that's something I am eager to avoid going through again, so something I've started keeping a lookout for in my life are those moments when I'm pushing a bit beyond my limits, even when it comes to pruning. Like with grapes, for example, in years past, I'd easily spend a few hours a day for weeks pruning grapes, trying to maintain a vineyard my grandparents left behind, which was weird of me because I had no reason to prune those grapes. I don't drink wine. I have no interest in selling it. I eat a few grapes, but I doubt I get through more than 1% of the grapes that they've planted, and it's not a process that I enjoy past the first few days. The only reason I was doing it was that if I didn't, I'd feel judged by my neighbors and family, which I think is the case with a lot of the pruning we do. We've decided, or in most cases, someone who taught us decided a long time ago that pruning has to be done in a particular way, and we never really stopped to reassess why. So the moment I realized that shame was the only reason I had for continuing, I stopped pruning the grapes altogether. And I've started approaching all of my pruning with that same attitude of like, is this necessary? A voice that I saw become really active this year while I was pruning our kiwis. As you might be able to tell, this group of kiwis has grown completely wild and are terribly pruned. They're kiwis left over from when our aunts were the caretakers of the land, so they're probably around 15 to 20 years old by now, and since no one made them a long-lasting structure for them to climb, and because they're off in a corner of the land we don't get to very often, the space has gotten wild. If I leave the space alone for a few months in summer, it gets completely overgrown with blackberry. I'm talking 2 meters of growth in the blink of an eye. So last year they didn't get pruned at all, which led to a problem. But not a problem of production, like most people would expect from unpruned kiwis. They probably produced more this year than almost any year I can remember. The problem is one of management. Because they're not pruned correctly, I had to spend way more time cutting my way through towards them, and then pruning my way through entirely too much growth and having to avoid dried out blackberry thorns. So a process that could have taken half an hour took me entirely too many hours over the course of 3 or 4 days. The challenge I'm realizing is that when it comes to kiwis, almost everything I'm doing is for me. I'm not pruning for the health of the plant. I'm pruning because I want to make it easier to build them a structure for them to climb, because that structure will make it easier for me to work around them. I'm pruning because I want bigger fruit. I'm pruning because I don't want to be cut by blackberry. So in this particular situation, pruning is completely unnecessary as far as the plant's concerned. But all this weighs against the fact that pruning these are not fun. It quickly becomes a hassle and I want to stop. It drains my energy and doesn't leave me feeling meaningfully fulfilled in any way that matters. And at the same time, I can't help thinking that if I stopped pruning them altogether, the fruit would come out smaller every year, yeah, but the birds would be thrilled. Which leaves me with this odd balance to find, because on the one hand, I'm pruning because I want to, but if I prune for too long, it leaves me feeling generally unfulfilled and kind of hating the whole process. So in order to care for myself, I think I've got to be able to prune when I feel like it, stop when I feel like it, and if I feel like leaving a whole section unpruned, free to do that as well, even if it doesn't make sense. Because any well-designed ecosystem, I think, has to consider not only the health of the plants, but also of the people and creatures who are a part of it. The other side of that coin has to do with the fact that sometimes work, and especially work that I can find a bit tedious, can be an amazing opportunity to engage with life and be present in my action. So I have to be on the lookout for moments when I'm pulling away from tasks because there's a part of me that's trying to save me from physical discomfort, who prefers to just go inside and watch a series or something. It's like the equivalent of choosing to eat cake instead of kale. Because considering I do spend too much time in front of screens, pruning is a chance to slow down, as well as another opportunity to feel into what I'm feeling by being actively present in my body, or taking time to ruminate about choices that are ahead of me, or to simply clear my mind and let myself be in my hands. When I can actually get over that initial inertia of not wanting to do something, if I can settle into the experience, and especially if I can slow myself down while I'm doing it, then there's a chance for pruning to become something really fulfilling. Especially if I'm pruning something like a hazelnut, which is just so giving. With hazelnuts, I'm simultaneously pruning for nuts, for mulch, and for rods, which we'll use for all sorts of projects around the forest. And because each variety of hazelnut has its own particular pattern of growth, it kind of forces me into that first step of caring, which is to just take a moment to sit and listen. I've got to consider that I only want 4 to 10 central trunks for production, but also as they're continually throwing out new shoots, I've got to figure out which of those new shoots I can thin away and which I can let thicken into rods for harvest in summer. And when I'm done pruning, they look pretty to me, and if I squint and I focus, I can even start to feel a bit of the hazelnut's gratitude to me. It's a process that feels good both while I'm doing it and when I'm done. And being attentive to that, working like this, is a reward in itself. I think genuine caring comes natural to a lot of people, but unfortunately, I am not one of them. So I'm having to teach myself how to listen, how to check in, how to give gifts, and how to remember myself in the process as well. This all makes pruning a really safe, low-stakes opportunity to develop these skills well enough that hopefully I'll be able to bring them into my relationship with the people I care about. Luckily, I am noticing that, like a muscle, the more I work these out, the better I get at them. Because among the many pieces of caring, some are mental and some are physical. And by physical here, I mean this like felt presence in the body, which means that caring is more than something I do, but it's also an experience, a feeling. And the more I learn to do the actions of caring, the more I'm opening myself up to feeling that caring. Which again, and I really can't stress this enough, I'm convinced that this is the most important skill anyone who works in regeneration can learn, because the ecosystems we're working with are just too new. I can't just learn all the rules of ecology and expect things to go perfectly well. And caring for forests is a generational skill the West is still developing. I'm sure our great-grandkids will probably look back at us and laugh at how simplistic some of our views of ecology are. But in the absence of a lot of that understanding about what an ecosystem needs, despite everything you might have heard on the internet, the answer is not to just read up on when and how to prune something, like a walnut, for example. Because one article will tell you you're supposed to do it at the end of winter before the sap starts running, and the next one will tell you that midsummer's the best moment. And they'll both have compelling reasons. The answer is to figure out for yourself what works best for your walnuts. And the best way to figure that out is to cultivate a genuine care for the health and well-being of those walnuts.